I trust everybody has a handout. Okay. Well, let me just begin the study by giving you perhaps an overview of what I'm hoping to accomplish in this time. And as far as how long it's going to take, I really don't know. As you know, eschatology is a very broad subject, a very large subject, because there's a lot said about it. And there's also a lot of disagreement on what exactly is going to happen in the last days, as I'm sure you also well know. There are probably as many views as there are people in the church. We can't obviously deal with all of them, but we are going to look at the main views. And we're not going to spend a great deal of time looking at premillennialism or dispensational premillennialism in particular. Probably spend the bulk of the time looking at Amill and Postmill, but that's only because personally I believe that the premill position isn't really possible. What we're going to do is we're going to, in this first part of the study, just do an overview of the different views. We're going to look at some principles that I believe should give us some pause regarding dispensationalism, as far as the Jewish character of the millennium, the reasons why they hold it and believe that there is going to be an earthly millennium and why it's going to be distinctively Jewish. But afterwards, we're going to deal with why the Scripture tells us that premillennialism isn't really a possibility. So what we're going to do in this study is, besides an overview on the first lesson, we're going to call into question the Jewish character of a millennium. Okay, that's going to challenge dispensational thinking. In the second lecture, we're going to deal with premillennialism and challenge that idea. And I think by the time we're done with that, we should have eliminated both possibilities. That sounds like a rather large order, but I do think it is possible to do, although it may take more than one lecture to close the door on premillennialism. Which means we'll be left with two primary views. Now, I do think that there is value to studying what is the correct view, and I realize this is prejudiced somewhat. I think there is value to studying the correct view instead of studying all the false views all the time, and knowing all the intricacies of the views, let's say, that we're not going to accept, that we're not going to hold. I'm going to show you why those aren't even possible, and so why study them, to a great deal of, in great detail if they're not even possible. But if we study the truth, if we study, what the Scriptures do tell us plainly about end times, I think it'll grow on you more and more that these first two views aren't really a possibility. So, in other words, the more you study the genuine article, the more you're going to see the counterfeits or the false views as not even being possible. Does that make sense? Okay, I mean, for instance, if we were going to study the deity of Christ, we would want to study all the false views constantly and know all the intricacies of those things. We'd want to study the biblical evidence for the deity of Christ, and then you'll see that all those other views are wrong. Okay, so that's the same approach we're going to take here, but we'll do it hopefully in a systematic way. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin with an overview of the different views, the four main views, beginning with dispensational premillennialism, and then historic premillennialism, then amillennialism, and then postmillennialism. Okay, first of all, dispensational premillennialism. I would say that of all the views of eschatology that there are today, that is probably the most widespread view, at least in the broad evangelical church today, at least what we would consider to be the churches that we're interested in. Although when we get to the Amill position, we're going to find that the largest churches, the largest denominations in the world, hold that view. So technically, the Amill position is probably the most widely held. But the most popular, the most published, the one that we hear the most about is the dispensational premillennial view. And that's why it seems to be the most prevalent view today. That view, does anybody know when that view actually originated? Do you know how old that view is? Dispensational premillennialism. Does anybody know just how?
1930. No, that's, wait.
1930?
You're talking about Darby?
Darby, yes, J. and Darby.
1930.
Okay, probably when he was beginning to popularize the view. You can see his dates on here, 1800 to 1882. Now let me ask you this question. Just because a view is recent, does that make it wrong? Okay, no, it doesn't. So the fact that a view is older doesn't necessarily make it right. Okay, because we are still learning things, aren't we, from the Scriptures? Okay. So the fact that this is a Johnny-come-lately doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. Okay. But it is something that just recently, or in the last couple hundred years, has basically come into reality, and then of course become very popular. J. N. Darby didn't actually popularize the view as much as C.I. Scofield did in his study Bible that was published in 1909 and then revised in 1917. And I understand they kind of want to hide that 1909 edition, because it did contain various serious errors that were later corrected. And by the way, I think Scofield himself was a lawyer, wasn't he? I don't think he was a theologian by any means. Just thought that he's probably a student of the Bible and thought it would be helpful for everybody to know his thoughts, and so made a study Bible, and that really popularized this view. And then, of course, the founding of Dallas Seminary in the early 20th century by Chafer, who rejected his Presbyterian background, and as a matter of fact, there were those even in the split that took place in 36 of the PCUSA and the OPC, or within that original conservative group that came out, there were actually premillennialists in it, some dispensational premillennialists. Okay. Alrighty, so what are the main features? Here's where a chart would have been handy. I didn't have time to put one together because they're very difficult to put together with those computer programs. I wanted to find the one I had done previously, and if I can find it, actually I think I did find it, but I don't have the program to open it anymore because this was a number of years ago. But hopefully you'll get the idea of what's going on here. Now, the main features of dispensational premillennialism, why they hold the views that they hold, and I think these are pretty much the main things. First of all, they insist on a literal, wherever possible, principle of interpretation. So what they do is they approach the Bible, they look at all the different types of literature that are in the Bible. And there's several different types I hope we recognize. There's poetry and prophecy, vision, there's parable, and there's historic narrative, and there's what we call letters or epistles, epistolary literature, and so forth. And each of those actually would have, I hope we would all assume, a different set of rules to interpret them. Because poetry is highly symbolic in its language. It uses imagery quite a bit. Prophetic language especially. Different than historic narrative. It says, Abraham lived X number of years and he had a child and so forth, and you read the straightforward narrative or the facts. But if you read, then I saw a beast rising up out of the ocean that had 7 heads and so forth, we don't necessarily want to treat that in the same way as we do the historic narrative. But the thing is, with dispensationalism, they will. They will treat the visions as try to interpret that as they would historic narrative, unless they believe they can't do that. It would be absurd to do that, or for some other reason it's not. They know it's not the right way to do it, and then they'll accept it as a symbol or a sign, vision, something like that. Okay, so that's the reason why when they look at Revelation 20 and they read about a 1,000-year period, they say there's going to be a 1,000-year period. And they're not the only ones who say that. Some post-mills say that. Historic pre-mills certainly say that, believing that date or that figure of time, that amount of time, to be literal, when as a matter of fact it may simply be a symbolic number, because it's in a prophecy that is highly symbolic and visionary. Okay. They believe the land promised to Israel, that it hasn't been fulfilled, and that it must be fulfilled exactly as the Lord says that it would be, and that can't be pointing beyond itself to something else. Okay, so it has to be interpreted literally. And they do that again with virtually everything. They do, in their study of last things, give priority to one particular passage in the Bible, and that's in Revelation 20 with regard to the 1,000 years. Now this is going to be a key point, because what they do is they come to Revelation 20, into this book that is highly visionary, that is prophetic literature. They look at that 1,000 years and they say, this is a literal figure. This must take place. It must take place according to the sequence of Christ coming again. He's going to bind the enemy, and it's going to be bound for 1,000 years. We're going to have this 1,000-year period. Then afterwards, Satan is going to be released. And so here we have Christ's second coming, the binding of Satan, a 1,000-year period. So we have premillennialism. Christ comes before the millennium, the 1,000 years, and then the loosing of Satan. Okay. And then what they do is they take they say, well, that's perfectly clear, isn't it? And then they go to the rest of the New Testament and they take all the passages that have to do with end times there and they fit it into Revelation 20, giving Revelation 20 the priority, even though the other passages are in epistolary literature, which is straightforward and much clearer. And whereas Revelation 20 is in a highly symbolic and visionary literature. Okay, so that's going to, of course, determine the way that they're going to understand the 1,000 years and how everything else fits into it, giving Revelation 20 the priority, fitting the rest of the New Testament and everything in the Old Testament into that passage. Okay. And then, of course, the key to dispensational theology is the idea that God has two groups of people and two separate plans for these two groups of people. Okay, He has a separate plan for Israel and for the church. And put on your thinking cap here because I think you should be fairly familiar with this. This is what you've probably heard in other churches that you've been in. This is what I was taught when I was growing up in the various churches that I went to. First of all, they believe that the church age is a parenthesis, a mystery that was unknown in the Old Testament, something that God had not revealed, but something that actually came into being when Christ, the Messiah, finally came, according to prophecy, was presented as king to Israel, and Israel rejected her king. At that point, God puts Israel's plan, or His plan for Israel, on hold. And He turns to the Gentiles. And that is the church age. That is a parenthesis. That is, you might call it Plan B, although it may not be terribly, I forget the word I'm looking for, but it's not going to make them look terribly good. Okay, or God, right? Plan B. No, God. I mean, they understand God intended to do this, and He knew that Israel was going to reject the Messiah and so forth, but He just hadn't revealed it to us. So this is His plan, but it was something He hadn't told us about. Now you realize that in dispensational thinking that in the 70 weeks of Daniel, you have the 69 weeks and you have the coming of the Messiah, and they believe that that's when He was presented as the King of Israel. So at the end of the 69 weeks, you have the coming of the Messiah. They believe, again, that that's at the end of His ministry when He's presented as King. Israel rejects Him. The clock stops, week 69. And the 70th week still remains. But because His plan has stopped, there's going to be this parenthetical period of time that's going to be the church age. It's going to separate the 69th week from the 70th week, which is in the future. And that 70th week is the 7 years that they believe the book of Revelation actually refers to. And that's the tribulation period divided into two periods, the tribulation and the great tribulation period and the Antichrist and all those other things that fit in there. Okay. Now that parenthetical period of time will actually end when Christ comes to rapture His church. You take then the church out of the world, and then the Lord turns again to Israel, and the 70th week begins. So Christ doesn't actually come a second coming, but He comes partway into the outer atmosphere. I'm not sure exactly how that works or how far down He comes, but He comes in perhaps the clouds, maybe He comes into the, somewhere up there. But He doesn't actually come down and touch ground. That only happens at the second coming. So He comes down, calls the dead out of the grave, translates the living. We call that the rapture, of course, and a partial resurrection. And then takes them to be with Him in heaven while He turns to Israel and begins dealing with them. So I think I've covered now point B. They believe then that the second coming will actually come at the end of the tribulation period, and that'll be the time when the nations will be gathered together, at least all those living that remain alive, and they'll be separated, sheep and goat judgments. And those that were actually believers and who were faithful that missed the rapture, they weren't faithful in believing when the rapture took place, but were converted or repented or rededicated their lives afterwards. Those will actually be brought into the kingdom, into the millennial kingdom, whereas the wicked will be cast at least into hell at that point. Okay? And at the same time, the Jews who lived prior to the church age will also be raised to enjoy their millennial kingdom. So the character of the millennium is going to be distinctively Jewish, and this is what God had promised to the Jews, and in that millennium, God is going to fulfill all the promises that He made to Israel. Okay, all those that He had made that He had not yet fulfilled. And that would include the land promise, which they believe has not been fulfilled yet. And the Messiah will be, and there's a lot of differences of opinion on this. There's no monolithic view of dispensationalism. Some believe that Christ is actually going to be reigning in a earthly Jerusalem during the millennial period in Palestine. Others believe that David will actually be, on that throne, because it does say that David will be reigning over it, that God's going to restore the tabernacle of David. And so they believe that David will be on the earthly Jerusalem reigning and ruling, and that Jesus will actually be in the heavenly Jerusalem ruling and reigning. By the way, the church would then be in the heavenly Jerusalem because they were raptured up, but then there's Jews and Gentiles who are living on the earth, and they're being ruled by David, okay? All right. Now, at the beginning of that period, I forget whether I mentioned this, that, let's see, obviously those who go into the millennium are going to be still physical beings, and they're not going to be glorified, nothing's going to be changed, but they're going to live a long time, there's going to be peace and prosperity, Satan will be bound, children will be born, you have all faithful coming in, but over that 1,000-year period you do have children being born, and not all of these are going to be converted. And so at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is released. He gathers all the people he can that are unconverted, and they turn out to be a majority of the people. And they basically bring a persecution against the believers, and then Christ from heaven sends fire and devours them and destroys the wicked, and then He raises them for the great white throne judgment. And then after that great white throne judgment, the new heavens and the new earth come in, and the eternal state. Now that, like I said, is just a brief overview of the dispensational view. By the way, they also do believe that the temple is going to be rebuilt during the millennium, and that sacrifices will be reinstituted. Though they recognize that those sacrifices do not take away sins, they do have to do justice to the sacrifice of Christ. They believe they're memorial sacrifices, but because the Bible says sacrifices are going to be reinstituted, at least as they see it, those things have to come about in the millennial period. Are there any questions about that, Bridget?
If they're going to be doing that, what's the purpose?
If they're going to be?
They're going to be reinstating that, you said.
Yeah.
It's not going to do anything.
Okay, the question is, why are they going to reinstate the sacrifices? And the only answer that can be given is they're just memorial sacrifices that are looking back to, you see, I don't agree with the view, so I can't really support that or even think of a good reason why that would happen. But, what's it pointing back to? The Old Testament sacrifices? No, because they were pointing to Christ. So then are you taking animal sacrifices and having them point back to the sacrifice of Christ? Well, that doesn't seem to make sense. All they can say is, well, that's God's will. And so, He wants that to happen. That's what's going to happen. Chris?
As you said, there's actually a plurality of thought with regards to dispensational premillennialism. One of the thoughts is that Jews are still saved by being Jewish. There are groups of people that say that that God instituted the Jewish religion, and thus they would be saved by that. They'd argue that the sacrifices are for Jews somewhat salvific.
I imagine, I've actually heard that especially applied even to today's time frame. I'm trying to, I guess, give dispensationalism their best foot forward instead of their worst, because that is a very, very serious error. There are some that believe that Jews are saved today, or can be saved, through the Jewish ceremonial system, although that system is not in force. They're trying to rebuild that temple. As you know, we've heard about that for years and so forth, and they probably do want to rebuild it because that's part of their system. But how can they be saved by sacrifices that can't be done? By the way, the book of Hebrews tells us that that system was completely done away with, and that even those Jewish converts at that time that were tempted to go back into that system would be destroyed with that system if they went back, and they would in fact be denying Christ, and it would be perhaps impossible to renew them again to repentance. Maybe the dispensationalists aren't thinking about those that come forward to Christianity and go back, but even those who are part of it are going to be destroyed with it, because it can't save them anymore. When Christ was crucified on the cross and the veil was torn, that was an end to the system. Okay, Patty, you've had your hand up.
Is that most Catholics premill?
Actually, we find out, or I was surprised to find out, that most Catholics are Amil. Yeah. That seems to be the official position of their church, yes.
I have a question. If what they say that the Jews, that's why they fight with other people. Because they want that land, because that's where they're supposed to build the pit or whatever it is for the sacrifices.
Oh, you mean the reason why why Israel's fighting with Palestine? Well, it's first of all because they do believe the land belongs to them. Not all of those Jews were necessarily the type that want to rebuild the temple, but certainly they are in that group. The Palestinians are fighting against them because the Jews took the land away from them; they want it back, you know. But they hold on to that because that is the land that God gave them. Yeah, that's their land historically. Yeah. Of course, we say, well, they have a point there. Well, certainly, if God gives somebody land, they ought to, you know, be able to hold on to it. But whose land do we possess today? You know, land has sort of changed hands over the years through a series of wars and so forth. Craig?
Yeah, in relation to what you said earlier, it's probably worth pointing out that the Old Testament system that was done away with never saved anybody, because God found fault with the people.
Greg is saying that the Old Testament system never saved anyone anyway, and certainly the sacrifices didn't, but what they pointed to did, and that was the type and the picture. That's why when the pictures were replaced by the reality, why the pictures were done away with, and why they should remain done away with. Okay. Any other questions on that point? I realize that this could be a very broad view to try to understand this. Yes, Donna?
So are they saying then that when Christ, that the second coming is before the millennium?
Yes, second coming before the millennium.
That has to do, and the nations will be judged, the righteous will be judged at that point in time? And then the great white throne is for those who made it through the tribulation, or the 1,000 years?
You know, this is going to require more digging into the dispensational view, and it's something I actually avoided because I was thinking once we just sort of remove the possibility, we don't have to worry about trying to figure out all the different judgments that actually take place. But we do know this. They do believe that when the church is raptured, that the church is judged. They do believe at the end of the tribulation period that those that survive that period are judged. And they do believe at the end of the millennium, all the dead who are unconverted of all time are raised and judged. But the problem is there's a lot of people that slip through the cracks there. That's not enough judgments to cover everybody. I mean, what about the righteous that make it through the tribulation? When are they judged? Or through the millennium? When are they judged? I don't see a judgment for them. But you do have to have a judgment, a separate judgment for the righteous. There's one for the church, one for the tribulation saints. But then where's the one for the millennial saints? And by the way, it gets really strange too, because some believe that the New Jerusalem during the millennium is orbiting the earth, doesn't actually come down. And that's the separation again between these two groups of people. The church is up here and Israel is down here, even though you have Jews up here and Gentiles down here. The Jews that were saved during the parenthesis, during the church period, are actually up in the New Jerusalem, and they're not down enjoying this millennium because they're a part of the church and they're not a part of Israel anymore, so to speak. And the Jews then who are here basically have the primacy, where the Gentiles are sort of subordinate. Up there, the Gentiles have the primacy and the Jews are subordinate. But then you also have interchange going on between these two different cities, and you have glorified saints. You have this 1,500-mile square city, or is it cubic miles? So the 1,500 cubic miles, that's big. That's the size of a planet almost, or a moon. Anyway, it's orbiting the earth, this big cube of gold, right? And there are people that are living up there, but they're all glorified. Okay, but they're also coming down to earth, and they're having discussions with people on earth, and you see these glorified saints. You'd wonder, especially because the people who hold this are primarily Arminian, and they believe that people are going to choose Christ or not choose Christ, and they're going to have these glorified people around them all the time. And how could you, if you had the ability to choose Christ and you have all this evidence in front of you, how are you going to reject that? But then there are those who believe at the end of the millennium, the church and Israel remain separate, and the cube stays up in the skies. Tempted to say something about that, but and the earth remains separate. But others believe that the cube is actually going to land, and then the two will become one at the end. So anyway, you see what happens when you have to keep things separate. You have these two separate plans, almost two separate destinies. You have two different ways of salvation, several different judgments, several resurrections, several comings. So anyway, it's very complicated. That's why, as I mentioned before, when Bob Strimple started to teach about Amillennialism, he basically said this is going to be very simplified, or what he called strimplified. Strimplified eschatology, which deals with just the nuts and bolts. It's really quite simple. It's not nearly so complicated. Okay, anyway, and we'll say more about that as we go along, as far as what dispensationalists believe and why we don't need to see it that way. Now let's move on to historic premillennialism, which I think we would all admit is less common than dispensational premillennialism, I think, as far as premillennialism goes. It actually has a much longer history. It was held by such men as Justin Martyr, who lived from 100 to 165, Irenaeus, who was born sometime in the 2nd century and died somewhere around 202, and Tertullian, whose dates are around 160 to 220. Held more recently by John Gill and Charles Spurgeon. As you know, Reformed Baptists, I believe in England. I think John Gill was in England too, wasn't he? I think so. George Eldon Ladd, who is one of the writers in the last century on the subject, and I believe he was professor of, not sure what he was professor of, but I think he was at Fuller, maybe during its better years. And then Francis Schaeffer, who is PCA. And let's see, Gordon Clark, who was OPC, and I think he was various other things. And James Montgomery Boyce. I was actually quite surprised to find out that he held that view. Now, this is one of the areas where, interestingly enough, the Westminster Confession doesn't actually allow for historic premillennialism, but it's something that has been tolerated within the denomination. And can somebody tell me what denomination Boyce was in? I don't know.
PCA.
PCA? Okay, PCA. I do know it was a Presbyterian church. I was assuming it wasn't the PCUSA. Okay, so PCA. Alrighty, so what do they teach? Well, first of all, they see, and this is something that everybody else agrees on, but dispensational premillennialism, they reject the idea that God has separate plans for Israel and the church. Now that shrinks the whole thing down considerably as far as how difficult it is to get a handle on this, okay? Because you don't have to make all those divisions and distinctions. Now, they do believe that at the end of the church age, and by the way, they would see that Israel and the church, if there isn't a separate plan, that the church is basically the fulfillment of the promises made to Israel, okay? And so when Christ comes, he brings in the new covenant, all the blessings come, those Old Testament types and shadows are pretty much fulfilled, but at the end of this period there is going to be the apostasy, there is going to be a tribulation period. But because they don't divide between the church and Israel, guess what? As dispensationalists believe that Israel was going to go through that tribulation period, they believe that the church is going to go through the tribulation period before Christ returns. And so that's where you get basically a post-tribulation rapture. And I think they also then, of course, reject the two returns of Christ, because you don't have one before the tribulation to remove the church, but you have one after the tribulation to remove the church. Now, they do still believe, though, that there will be a 1,000-year period following Christ's return when Satan's going to be bound, peace and prosperity will flourish, but they deny the millennium will have a distinctively Jewish character, and they deny the fact that the temple is going to be rebuilt and sacrifices reinstituted. So this is a very strimplified premillennialism, or simplified. Okay. Now they do believe at the end of the millennium Satan is going to be released, because you do have living people going into that millennium, and you still have children and so forth that are going to be born, and he's going to deceive the nations, and you're going to have the same cataclysmic end that you would have with dispensational premillennialism. Then Christ is going to destroy the wicked, and there's still going to be the final judgment. And I wasn't quite, though, able to find out. Maybe somebody could tell me if you know what the view is, whether they believe that there's any kind of a judgment prior to that final judgment at the end of the millennial period. That's something that I wasn't quite clear on. Okay, it's not going to be that important, but all right. So in both historic and dispensational premillennialism, they believe the reason why it's called premillennialism is because Jesus comes prior to the millennium. And then there's a millennial period following, and then and that's a 1,000-year period. I think pretty much they both view it as a literal 1,000 years. And then comes the final judgment. Now, one other interesting thing to note as we go through these different views is that, oddly, dispensational premillennialism, historic premillennialism, and postmillennialism all have something in common. And that is that there is a millennium. Okay, a millennium where there's going to be peace, prosperity, and so forth. Okay? And the Amill, though, they deny that. Now, certainly postmill and Amill have so much in common as far as the sequence of events, and that's really the only thing that they disagree on. And really the only thing the historic, well, except for those two judgments, or if there are two judgments, I'm not quite sure, but the main difference between the historic premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism is that Christ comes prior to this period called the millennium in or premillennial view.
But you don't know why.
Why what?
Why does he come? What does he choose when he comes? Before
In the second coming, you mean?
yeah.
Yeah, that's going to require a little bit of study, because if Christ comes prior to the millennium and he raptures the church, and they obviously believe that too, what does that leave for the millennium? That's an interesting question. Would it be those that weren't ready and were? What comes at the end of the tribulation period? I mean, the only believers that are there are raptured. So unless they come back down to live in that millennium, all you have then are the wicked going into the millennium to begin with. I don't know. That's an interesting question. Do you think?
The events with the rapture would be that which kind of triggered them to accept Christ, kind of thing. Because I mean, yes, they would be wicked, but then again, according to their view, we're all wicked until we choose Christ.
Okay.
And so then the rapture, and then the documents will be left behind saying, this is what we said would happen. They can read the documents and learn about God that way, I guess.
That's quite possible. Okay. By the way, that reminds me that there was another view, and that's one we'll get to later, that believes that's already happened. The rapture has already happened, and it took all the Christians out, and yet the church still continued because there were a number of people who were sort of on the edge and backslidden perhaps, and they suddenly converted, and so the church continued.
When did the rapture happen?
AD 70.
AD 70?
Yeah. 70 AD, destruction of Jerusalem, somewhere in that time frame. And the interesting question would be exactly when did it happen in that time frame. That would be what's called the radical preterist view. Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on then to the Amill position. By the way, there's a lot that is involved in this whole, this whole subject that we're not necessarily going to deal with directly. We're going to try mainly to build a positive view of eschatology and not deal with all the different possible things. So I think that would actually be quite a bit easier to do, and also quite a bit more helpful, because once we come to grips with what the Bible says, then we see things that don't agree with that, then we can say, well, no, that's wrong because of this passage, it's wrong because of that passage. We don't even have to work through the whole system to try to figure it out to begin with. Okay, the Amill view. One of the two primary views held in the Reformed tradition. What would the other view be? The other view besides the Amill view or the postmillennial? And I also put a note in here that there certainly have been those in the Reformed tradition who have held to both forms of premillennialism. As I mentioned, their historic premillennialism is tolerated in this denomination. And there was actually a split off of that conservative group that came out of the PCUSA in '36 that formed the Bible Presbyterian Church. And I think they were, some of them, dispensational premillennialists. Okay. This is also, by the way, Amillennialism is also held by the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Disciples of Christ, and the Anglican churches. So it's pretty widely held. And by the way, the question was asked earlier, I think, about why is the Roman Catholic Church amillennial? And the reason is because Augustine actually held that view. As you know, Augustine held Protestant views, and he held what we would call Roman Catholic views, and the Roman Catholics look at him as one of the fathers of the faith because of the views that he held that were in common with them, and the Protestants also claim him as a father because of the views that he held in common with them. So, yes, Greg?
Just in terms of the Anglican Church, it's probably worth, that may have been true at one time, that they were distinctively of this view, but I suspect the truth now would be that they accept just about everything.
Ah, okay.
When you can have bishops who are atheists accepted within the church, you can certainly have scope for a number of views on eschatology.
Sadly. Okay. So the Anglican Church today is so broad-minded that anything probably will be accepted in that denomination. Okay, so one of the things we need to see about the Amill position also is that it is old. It originated probably around the same time as historic premillennialism. By the way, it appears as though premillennialism had a different name in those days. They call it Chiliasm, Chiliasm I think is the right term. If you're a Chiliast, if you believe in a literal 1,000-year reign with Christ on the earth and that type of thing. And there were those that distinctively denied that position, and those who did were basically labeled Amills or no Chiliasm, no Chiliast. As a matter of fact, that's what Calvin called it, and he spoke very strongly against the idea of a premillennial return of Christ. But Justin Martyr, again, you see his dates, mentioned other views in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew, which was one of his books, one of the works that is extant or continues today. Some believe that Pseudo-Barnabas, and it was called Pseudo-Barnabas because Barnabas didn't write it. It originated somewhere between 70 and 131, but yet the author called himself Barnabas, held to this position. Clement of Alexandria and Origen denied Chiliasm, and Augustine in 354 to 430, those are his dates, systematized it, and that is why it's a part of the Roman Church. Now, the main features of this position, again, it denies the distinction between the two groups, Israel and the church. It recognizes that the biblical principle, which I think we should also attribute to the historic premill, that you interpret different genre, different types of literature in the Bible according to its particular character, and you don't just treat everything the same. Well, I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, it believes that there is no millennium, such as the premillennial and postmillennial view teaches, and that would include both millennium or both premill views. I mentioned the thing that they had in common was that each of them saw a period of time of peace and prosperity. The postmill doesn't necessarily believe that to be 1,000 years, a literal 1,000 years, maybe, or it may be a longer period of time. I think the two premills see it as pretty much a literal view or a literal time frame. But they all saw it as a time when Satan is bound more strictly, that there's peace, prosperity, longevity, blessings, and so forth. Okay? And the reason why, of course, is because of what the Scripture says about a time frame where something like that's going to happen. Okay. The question is, when is it going to happen? For the post-mill, it's going to happen before Jesus returns, but for the pre-mill, it's going to happen after he returns. All right. But the all-mill does not believe that such a period is actually going to take place. Rather, they see the millennium, or that 1,000 years, referred to by Revelation 20. And by the way, you understand that that's where we get the word millennium. That's where we get the 1,000 years. That's the only place it appears, is Revelation 20. Hence, dispensationalists going to that passage first, right? They believe, the Amil believes that time frame, that 1,000 years, is actually referring to now, right now. And the time from Christ's first coming to his second coming, the time in between. Okay? Now the post-mills don't necessarily believe, although some may, that it refers to that time frame, but they believe it's going to take place somewhere in that time frame. Okay? Does that make sense? So the Amil sees it first coming, second coming, that's the millennium, that's the 1,000 years. Post-mill, it may be that time frame altogether, but there is going to be a time when there's going to be peace, prosperity, and this wonderful golden age, and that's going to be somewhere before Christ returns. Okay. So anyway, that's the Amil view there. They believe that the promises made to the Jews, and this is something, again, I think we should attribute to the historic premill, are fulfilled by Christ to the church during that time frame, which we call the church age, and it's not a parenthesis, but those promises were fulfilled, and we're going to see, if we have time, we're going to see how that works today. They believe that Satan is bound, but not absolutely bound. Okay? He is bound in a certain sense, and that is that he might not deceive the nations any longer and keep them in darkness so that the gospel can go forth and all the nations can be discipled, or at least the gospel can reach all the nations and he can gather in his elect. Where in times past Satan was able to keep the world except for Israel in darkness, and although he did a pretty good job on Israel too in a number of cases, the light was never fully extinguished. Now he is restricted, so he can't do that. Okay? And they believe at the end of the millennium, Satan will be released, bring about the great apostasy, the second coming will take place, followed by the general judgment and the eternal state. So, at the end of the millennium period, which is just before Christ's return, there will be an escalation of persecution, and some believe it'll just be sort of a neck and neck. Sometimes the kingdom of heaven gaining the ascension, sometimes the kingdom of Satan, although it seems like the kingdom of Satan has the foothold most of the time. But Christ is going to come and he's going to put an end to that. He is going to bring about the rapture of the church. He's going to raise all the dead. He's going to translate all the living and bring them all together for a final judgment, a final disposition, and then the eternal state. That's really quite simple, isn't it? Very, very, very simple. You don't have all these. It's a lot easier to describe. And some of this was over against their position, so that's what made it a little bit more difficult. Okay, is that clear? Are both of those positions clear then? Historic premillennialism, amillennialism, and by the way, the A in front of millennialism or millennium means no millennium. Okay, right. Postmillennialism, another view that's widely held in the Reformed tradition. This one is not. If it has ancient roots, we'd have to dig a little bit deeper to find them. It could be that maybe some of those that denied Chiliasm, maybe they saw some optimism. I've heard, although I couldn't find the evidence for it when I was preparing this study, but I have heard that the post-mill view was as old as the Amill view, but that may not necessarily be the case. Okay, but it does certainly dominate, it seems, in the 16th and 17th centuries among the Puritans. One writer mentioned that the Puritans, were not just sitting around theorizing whether the millennium was going to be, whether it was going to be an Amill or a post-mill view. They were out there trying to make post-millennialism happen. Okay, there's a big difference between those two things, isn't there? But I think that they saw a post-millennial eschatology as an encouragement to them to do more, because they believed that through their activity the kingdom of God was actually going to triumph in this world. Whether it does or not, or whether we believe that or not, we still need to do that. But if you do have that in front of you, that can be a great encouragement. But also the Reformed theologian Coxaeus, Witzius, and Abrakel. By the way, Abrakel would have held that position probably because he was converted through the writings of the Puritans. He lived during the time of the Dutch Second Reformation, which was brought about by Puritan literature, being translated into Dutch and widely read in the Netherlands. Was also widely held among the New England Puritans and the Scottish Presbyterians of the 18th century and Presbyterians of the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, Charles Hodge and A.A. Hodge and B.B. Warfield and Machen and Murray and all these guys were post-mill. And really what tended to bring about a change within the theological environment between the post-mill, which was predominant in that time frame, to an amill were the world wars. See, it depends on how you formulate the postmillennial view and how you believe the millennium is actually going to be introduced. If you have the idea that things are gradually getting better and they're just going to keep getting better, sort of a linear, slope, you keep getting better and better and better and better, well, then you run into World War I and II. It's like, your line goes way down and sort of hits the ground, and something's wrong with this position, right? So it depends on how your post-mill view or how this golden age is introduced. If you believe it's that gradual process, or whether you believe it's going to happen suddenly through a supernatural work of the Lord, an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. That appears to be what Edwards believed and what the Scottish Presbyterians of the 18th century believed, that there would be a great revival like the Great Awakening that would envelop the whole earth and would last for a long period of time. Okay. So anyway, what are the main features of this position? They embrace, again, the biblical principle of interpretation that treats each passage according to its literary type. They reject the distinction between Israel and the church. They believe the promises made to the Jews are fulfilled by Christ to the church. They believe that there is a... here's where they differ, of course, from the Amill position, and the only place, I think, that they mainly differ. That there's a future time of peace and prosperity that will take place before Christ returns and last for a long period of time. In other words, the kingdom of heaven will triumph on earth this side of glory. Okay, and we'll get into the reasons why they believe that later. But the one area that they disagree with the Amill is the one area that they actually agree with the historic and dispensational premill, except, of course, for the Jewish distinctives of the dispensationalists. They do believe that Satan is bound now so that he might not deceive the nations in the same way the Amill, so the kingdom of heaven can advance, but that he will be bound more absolutely in the future. And they believe at the end of the millennium, and again there are differences of opinion here, Satan will be released, bring about the great apostasy, the second coming will take place, followed by the general judgment and the eternal state. Okay. So the Amill and Postmill are virtually identical, except the Postmill may have a more optimistic, does have a more optimistic view of how things are going to turn out. Although I have heard such terms used as optimistic Amill and pessimistic Postmill. Whether those two are actually meet in the middle, I don't know. But does everybody have then a general understanding of the different positions? When we talk about pre and post, we're talking about the return of Christ in relationship to the millennium. When we talk about dispensationalism, we're saying there is this distinction between the church and Israel, two groups of people, and the main reason why they come to that conclusion is because of their hermeneutic principle that basically teaches that you take it as a literal unless you can understand it that way. Let's see. Well, I guess that's pretty much what we have to say about that. Are there any questions up to this point? I actually wanted to stop right there thinking it's going to take the whole time just to get through that and not develop this second section, which it shows us that the New Testament writers did not understand those Old Testament prophecies in the way the dispensationalist looks at it. But they understand these things as being fulfilled to the church, and that there aren't two separate plans. And there's only 5 minutes before the end of our time frame, so I don't want to launch off into this. So, does anybody have any questions regarding what we have seen? Questions or comments? Greg?
Could you expand a little bit? You said, in terms of postmillennialism, the kind of motivational incentive that provides for Christian living. Presumably all of the views, because of the mindset that they would engender, bring about certain advantages or disadvantages or things to watch out for in the way that you would live the Christian life.
Okay. So Greg was asking, can I expand on the idea of how one's eschatology would affect the way we would live now? Okay. Now, it is true that dispensational premillennialism and historic premillennialism and postmillennialism all see a golden age, right? But in both of the premill views, that golden age doesn't happen until Christ returns. And the time frame before that, before his return, is basically going to be a battle that is going on, and where the church and the kingdom of Satan, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of Satan are going to be fighting. And in a dispensational view, the church is always going to be just a remnant. It's going to be always basically on the fringes. Things are going to be getting worse and worse for the church until Christ comes and puts an end to it, and then the glorious time frame. Now, if that's your view, if that's your working assumption, that no matter how much we labor as a church, it's still going to be going backwards, and eventually is going to be brought to the brink, as it were, almost to extinction, but not quite. I think it's oddly enough, some also had a very optimistic view as to how many were actually saved. At the rapture, that the United States is actually going to be taken out of the world because 70% of them claim to be Christians. So you have this optimism on the one hand, but it's really not warranted by that theology, because they do believe that the kingdom of Satan is going to be primarily on the ascendancy. So that doesn't give you a lot of hope that your efforts are really going to pay off, but you'll still do it. You'll still do the work because Christ commands it, because there's, Christ is coming. You want to be faithful because there's a golden age ahead, and there's heaven ahead, and so forth. And those are encouraging reasons, and obviously we ought to be encouraged by those things. I think in the historic premillennial view, you have the same kind of difficulty. You still don't have an optimistic view that the church is going to make much headway, but you still do the work because Christ is coming, and you want to be found faithful, and because there is a millennium, and there's a heaven, and so forth. In the Amill view, you have basically that period of time before Christ's coming. Now, I guess that's an area where they have in common, is there's going to be a struggle that's going to continue all the way up to the end, okay, between the two kingdoms. And again, your motivation would be because Christ is coming, you want to be found faithful, and because there's the millennium. Well, not in the Amill view, but you have Christ coming, and you have the eternal state, and that's encouraging. And really, if Christ just simply tells us that you're going to, you need to do these things, and it's going to be hard all the way, and there's never going to be a golden age, or we still need to do it because we love Christ and because we want to obey Him, and so forth. But now, what if you believed, that the kingdom of heaven was actually going to advance, and there was going to come a time frame when it was going to advance tremendously. Well, you see, we're still in a time frame where we're still struggling. So we're kind of fighting in the same way. But we'd have this before Christ comes, that there's going to be this long period of time where the kingdom of heaven actually is going to inundate the earth, and everything that we've struggled and labored for, maybe we won't be here to see it happen, but we'll see it happen from heaven. It just seems to give an extra boost of optimism, to the work. Even though everyone should really have all that they need to serve, it just seems to give a little bit more optimism in that regard.
If I understand it correctly, the post-mill view would be that Christ could not return today.
Yes, the idea of, and that's something we'll have to look at as far as the imminent return of Christ. That is a motivation that some have. The return of Christ in the dispensational premill, the historic premill, and the amill is that He could come at any time. But the post-mill view obviously can't accept that position, because if there's this golden age that hasn't taken place yet, He can't come any day. So that part of the motivation is taken away. I guess I suppose if you knew that you were going to be visited and examined and judged at any time, you would certainly want to keep your house in order, right? I mean, Edwards himself, who was post-mill, by the way, did say that, and he didn't think Christ was coming for quite some time, did say that he wouldn't do anything that he would be afraid to do if he knew he was going to stand before God in an hour. There is that motivation that we might die at any moment too, so we always have to be ready. And some have actually called that a coming of Christ for us. That He comes particularly for you. It may not be the second coming, but it's still a coming of Christ. But we're going to get into the reason why post-mills, or at least post-mills of today, and Edwards was not of this persuasion, although I think he did interpret the idea of the imminent return of Christ as maybe along these same lines. But you really can't have an imminent return. But let me just go ahead and explain why post-mills, at least today, believe you don't have to have one, because they believe those passages referring to the imminent coming of Christ were really referring to AD 70 AD, and that they be ready when that judgment came against Jerusalem. Because if they weren't ready and they got caught in that siege of Jerusalem, that it was going to be miserable for them, as they see the book of Revelation primarily referring to that time frame where the Jews suffered tremendously inside Jerusalem. I think that they were even surrounded during the time of one of the feasts. So just as it was at Pentecost when the Lord brought through that feast all these Jews to hear His people speaking in their languages and so forth, and thousands were converted and so forth, when He brings judgment against them, it was during one of the times of the feast, so that they were surrounded when there was a huge number of people that were in Jerusalem. a lot of Jews, that's one way he could actually bring judgment on the Jews en masse. And then they're under siege for a long period of time, months and months and months. I think it was about 3.5 years or something close to that. I think the whole process lasted for about 3.5 years. You wouldn't want to be in a city crowded with people under siege by the Romans. You would starve, there would be disease, there was even warfare that was going on inside the city, civil war. There were people who were rich that were faring, you might say, sumptuously every day, while others were starving and eating their children. I mean, just horrible things that were going on. So the imminent return of Christ then had to do with that primarily, and that's what they were to be ready for. And that's why John says, the time is near, and don't seal up the words of this prophecy, and Christ is coming quickly, and so forth. So, anyway. But we'll get into that as we go a little bit further. Any other questions about this, Tom?
Just a footnote, a comment. James Montgomery he just died, about 4 years ago?
It hasn't been a long time, yes.
Yeah, and so his church is about 10,000, and so the grandson of Billy Graham is going to take over his church, and they're going to combine churches, and it's going to be 20,000 members. It's going to be a huge church. And they only, the two churches are only about maybe 10 to 15 miles apart. And this is what I heard.
Oh, okay. Is that an indication the millennium is coming, or no? Do they hold premillennialism in common then between the two of them? I don't think Boyce was a dispensational premillennialist, but I would suspect that if Billy, of course, we can't say that Billy Graham's grandson necessarily is following the footsteps of his grandfather, but I believe his view is dispensational, Billy Graham. Yeah. Okay, any other questions, comments? Then hold on to your handout for next Lord's Day, and we'll look at some of the ways in which those promises made to the Old Testament church were fulfilled in the New Testament church. Okay, let's have a word of prayer.